Hello, this is our third and final lecture on Middle America. It got a little bit long, but sometimes there'll be two lectures, sometimes three for each world region. Okay, so we ended up talking about migration, and we talked about the international migration of people coming from the Middle America to places like the United States. Also within the region, going between countries, like from Guatemala into Mexico or from uh, Nicaragua into Costa Rica. And then within the countries, we also see migration, especially in Mexico, of people coming from the southern part, which is a little bit poorer, and making their way to the north to work in factories. Now, in terms of, we talked a bit about population, and in terms of racial and ethnic distributions, the majority of the populations in places like Mexico and Central America, like Honduras and Nicaragua and El Salvador, are mestizos. And mestizos are mixes of people of indigenous descent and Spanish descent. We also have Native Americans or Indian populations, especially in southern Mexico and Guatemala, the Yucatan Peninsula, and down on the Isthmus of Panama. We also have some ones that consider themselves white by self-identifying that way, and we see that mostly in Costa Rica. Now, on the Caribbean coastline, we'll talk about this with the Caribbean. We see a lot of people that are of African descent. They were brought over by the English and others to work on plantations or do logging. And so the cultures and the societies that are on that Caribbean coastline are much more aligned with the Caribbean than it is with Middle America. Now, that leads to things about class. So class are socioeconomic classes based on your income, your political power, things of that nature. And Middle America is very much known as relatively unequal in terms of income distribution and land distribution. So you have a small upper class. You also have a relatively small middle class that's upwardly mobile. We can think about doctors and lawyers and teachers and public workers. And then the majority of the population is considered lower socioeconomic class. And again, that represents the inequalities that you see in income distribution and land distribution in this region that has its origins in the historical era. Now, in terms of urban geography, this is a region that is relatively urban. You can see in Mexico and Costa Rica, it's over 75% of their population is urban. So we've seen large amounts of rural to urban migration historically and settling in cities. In the Central American countries, like Guatemala, Nicaragua, Honduras, El Salvador, even in Panama, it's a much lower percent. It's still above 50%, but it's not at that 75% level that many places, look for, such as the US, we're around 75 to 80% urban. Now we're going to get into some more cultural elements right now, and let's talk about religion. Traditionally, people have thought, especially after the Spanish and the Portuguese came across to the Americas, that much of Middle America and South America were Roman Catholics. And that is true. That's the dominant religion. But we also have to recognize that there are other religions. So this map hides other things. So Protestantism, indigenous religions, etc. So while Spanish Catholicism is dominant, it's not the only religion. And it's also been altered historically over time. So let's start out with some indigenous religions. Many of the indigenous or Native American religions were more animistic. That means there's a lot of worship of nature and finding power in nature. And polytheistic, meaning they had multiple deities. They also had religious ceremonial centers. If you think about a lot of the Mayan and Aztec locales, they're city-states. They were also ceremonial centers based on religion. And a key thing is that they were very inclusionary and syncretic. By inclusionary, I meant that they would actually allow in other religious beliefs into theirs. So if the Aztec or the Maya went and conquered a new people, they would incorporate some of their religious beliefs into their own. And so over time, a lot of religious things are similar between like the Olmec to the Mayan to the Aztec, etc. And syncretic means that they blend together. So there's a long history of inclusion and syncretisms in religion in Latin America, especially the pre-Columbian era, and today. Now, when the Spanish came over, one of their key things, they always said the three G's: God, glory, and gold. Not sure in which order. And in 1537, they had debates in Spain about whether, as well as in Italy at the Vatican, of whether indigenous people actually had souls. And it was ruled that they did have souls. And so hence, they had to try to missionize and convert them into Roman Catholicism. And here's a way that they would do this. You'd have disparate communities living in the mountains and small farming communities, and that was very difficult to access and to spread the word as well as to use their labor. So they resettled a lot of them into communities called reducciones. Then they'd go out and they'd say, what does this shrine do for you? What's your, traditional religion does for you? And they'd say something like, well, this mountain protects us from earthquakes. And then they would say, all right, let's destroy that shrine and let's replace it with Catholic imagery and say, Christ also protects you from earthquakes. And they would put either a cathedral or a church or whatever, a Christ image on that site. And for the local people, they're like, all right, it's the same thing it was before. Then they would teach Catholicism. And of course, there was language barriers, cultural barriers, and things of that nature. So many times when they taught Catholicism and they replaced that Catholic imagery, they were kind of superimposing the Catholic religion on native religions. And so hence we created syncretisms. Now, in some of the urban areas and with the more elite, they followed traditional Catholicism that's taught by the Pope and comes down from the Vatican. But the majority of the populations, they actually blended along the old religious beliefs with Catholicism. So here's an example. I think I showed this to you before. This is a big volcano, 17,000 feet in elevation, just outside of Mexico City. And on the other side, by Cholula, we have a Catholic church that's been placed right on top of an ancient pyramid. And this pyramid is the largest pyramid on Earth by volume, and it was developed over different thousands of years by different groups. When Cortez came to this area, the people there rose up against him, and so he defeated them, and then he decided to place his churches on all across the place on top of their sacred shrines. And so they put this cathedral right on top of this pyramid. Now, over time, this pyramid got overgrown and people forgot it was a pyramid until in the 1930s, they tried to make a road along here and they cut into it and they discovered that it was actually ancient ruins. And from that time on, they've been excavating in it, and you can actually walk through the entire pyramid through some of the hallways within it. Another place where this is an example is in Mexico City. This is the Zocalo. It's the third largest public plaza in the world, right in the heart of Mexico City, and it was at the heart of the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan. And so they destroyed the pyramids of the Aztec, and then they built the cathedrals on top of it and paved over the rest as a public square or plaza. Now, there's a crazy lady down the bottom left. That's my wife, just to let you know. It's not just me taking random pictures. But one thing that you'll notice is Mexico City is built on a lake bed. And as they've withdrawn the water from it, it's been sinking faster than Venice. And on the left-hand side of this image, you can see it starting to go down on the left-hand edges. Here's a better view where you can actually see that by the tour bus as it's going down and sinking. So they're trying to stabilize it, but as it's going down, it's uncovering Aztec ruins. So some people are saying the Aztec are coming back, although they never left. Other ones are Christ figures. And in a lot of places in the folk areas and in the rural countryside, and sometimes in the urban areas, they come up with these syncretic values, and they have their own symbolism, they have their own powers, their own personalities. So this is the Black Christ of Esquipulas in Guatemala. And this cathedral and this Christ figure were put right on top of an old Mayan deity. And it was a dark deity, but it had healing powers. So it had kind of sulfur springs and those types of clays that often have healing properties. And so people would go there to get healed. Well, they put in the Black Christ of Esquipulas, and over time, as they were using their candles, which they do in their traditional ceremonies, it started turning darker. And then they thought that it had its own powers. And so it's still to this day a pilgrimage site in Guatemala where 2 million people a year go there to be healed of their ailments. There's also reverence for the Virgin Mary, or the Virgin Mother. And for example, the Mayan had a mother goddess, Ixchel. And so that was related in a way. They thought that was related. The Aztec had a virgin mother goddess, Tenochtitlan. And so that's another way of seeing similarities in their religious beliefs that they could use to convert people. And then this Aztec mother goddess has a tie to the Virgin de Guadalupe. And the Virgin de Guadalupe is kind of the patroness of Mexico and one of those famous virgin figures in the world. And the story goes that back in the 1531 or so, a guy named Juan Diego, indigenous person, went to this mountain that they worshiped the Aztec Virgin Mother Goddess, and the Virgin de Guadalupe appeared to him. So he went back and told the priest that he had an apparition, and they're like, no, you have to prove it. Go back and find proof. So he went back and visited the Virgin de Guadalupe, and she said, put these flowers inside your cloak. And when you get to the priest, open it up. And as he did, the Virgin de Guadalupe appeared on his cloak. And so it was a miracle and kind of helped promote Roman Catholicism actually throughout Central America. I believe Juan Diego became a saint in around 2002, the first one from the Americas, if I'm not mistaken. Now, that being said, the fastest growing religion in Middle America is actually Protestantism. And you can see on this map, anywhere from 30% upwards are actually Protestants. And so when you go into these regions and hike around the mountains, you'll see these little churches. You'll hear, music coming off the hills and people singing and things like that. And that's these smaller Protestant denominations. And many of the priests are actually from there. American missionaries do go down to Central America, but what they often do is instead of missionizing themselves, they just train local preachers to do that because they're much more, they know the culture, they know the people much better. But that is the fastest growing religion in Middle America. Okay, we're going to do a little political geography and not go into too much detail. I'm just going to do a few examples because every country has a really deep political history. So in 1821, there was independence, and it was Mexico and Central America together. And they had their own, all of those countries were actually one independent country. But they broke up based on rivalries in 1838, and that's why you have the political boundaries we see today. These smaller states in Central America, whereas Mexico is still very large, of course. This is Father Hidalgo, who kind of led the early fight for independence from Spain. He wasn't successful, but he is an important figure in Mexican history. Now, in terms of Mexican politics, just a few little tidbits. Santa Anna, the very famous one from the Alamo, he was president 11 times and never once finished his term. He'd get thrown out, come back in, get thrown out, come back in. He actually lost one of his legs, and he made a monument to it. And then he got thrown out, and his leg disappeared. He came back in power, and they found it again. Then he was deposed, and no one knows where his leg is today. Some people think that the U.S. Marines took it in the Mexican-American War, and it's somewhere in the Northeast, but nobody knows where that leg is. Now, they had a liberal revolution in the early 1900s, and that led to a lot of really important changes that are still evident today. Agrarian reform. Agrarian reform means reform of the agricultural sector, and especially land holdings. Prior to this, the majority of land was held by few people, and the minority of people the majority of people had a very small amount of land. This took away a lot of the land from the church, as well as large landowners, and they created what are called ejidos. And this is community land. So an actual community, a village, they would get all the land around their village, and then they decide how they want to divide it up, how they want, who gets to grow what at this time. And it's a very interesting system. It also placed a lot of restrictions on the church. At this point, almost 50% of all the money in Middle America was held by the Catholic Church. So a lot of that was taken away, and they put a lot of restrictions on their land holding and things of that nature. Now, from 1946 to the year 2000, so for 54 years, one political party, the PRI, was in control. Can you imagine 54 years and having either the Republicans or the Democrats, doesn't matter, being the only party that was in control? And you can see how that could lead to a lot of issues, like corruption and nepotism and all these things like that. But since 2000, other parties have been elected to power. And so now it's much more of a true democracy in that they actually do have elections and it changes power between parties. And a lot of people think that's a healthy thing for a country. And then I come to Nicaragua. And again, I'm just doing like two countries because there's so much you could talk about in each one of these countries. But Nicaragua became independent and the neighboring countries didn't like it. And so they hired a guy named William Walker from the United States. They called them a filibuster at the time and basically mercenaries. He created an army in Louisiana and sailed down and went into Nicaragua and was successful in overthrowing it. But then he declared himself king. So the neighboring countries weren't very happy about that, and they were able to join together and defeat him. He left, got a new army, and came back, but this time he was defeated and was put to death by Costa Rican troops. But just kind of interesting about U.S. influence and how one person can create an army and go in to destabilize countries. Now, the U.S. occupied it from 1910 to 1933. We've done that to many countries. But then they elected a guy named Sandina, and the U.S. didn't like him very much, and so they supported a colonel in the Nicaraguan army, Somoza. And he became president and dictator basically for life. And then he passed it on to his sons. That's why I call it Somoza and Sons, from 1937 to 1979. And that family owned half of Nicaragua's wealth. But in 1979, the Sandinistas, named after the person that Somoza assassinated, Sandino, they formed the Sandinistas, and they came in and had a Marxist revolution. And that led to a civil war in Nicaragua with what are called the Contras. These were groups of people that the U.S. trained in Honduras and supplied, and they come across the border. And over 55,000 people died during the Civil War. They didn't declare peace until 1990. And since then, they've had a pseudo democracy. In 2006, this guy named Daniel Ortega, who was one of the leaders of the Sandinistas back in 1979. So instead of taking in a revolution, he came to power as an elected president. Now, since then, he's still in power. There's been a lot of controversial elections. I'll just leave it at that, not to get too embroiled in their politics. Now, as I mentioned, this has been involved quite a bit in overt and covert operations throughout this region. Mexico, 1846 to 1848, when the Marines came in. 1914, 1917. Honduras, again, several times. El Salvador, 1981. Nicaragua, as we mentioned. And then even Panama, which owes its existence to the United States. Panama was part of Colombia, but we wanted access so we could help build the canal that the French had failed at, to build the Panama Canal. So we went in and we helped them become independent. And then we were allowed to build the Panama Canal. Colombia still isn't very happy about that. And then 1989 to 1990, we went in and invaded Panama. They had a general and a president, Manuel Noriega. And at first, he was a friend of the United States. We won't get into too much on that, but he was involved in the cocaine trade and worked with the CIA to run things into the US in return for our support of him. But then in 1989, we stopped doing that. He got upset and declared war on the US, and so we invaded and we overthrew Manuel Noriega. But again, you can see that this is what we consider America's backyard. I'm not saying me personally, but that's how it always has been politically. And we've had a lot of influence, obviously, in this region. Now let's look at the economic structure and economic development of Middle America. During the colonial era, early on, the Europeans had what was called the mercantile system, and that was accumulating bullion, gold, silver, positive balance of trade. But it wasn't really productive. It was just trying to accumulate things. And so all this gold and silver that came from Middle America as well as South America coming back into Europe was accumulated there. Then that eventually was invested in productive things like the Industrial Revolution. And we'll talk more about that with the Caribbean. And then that led, with the Industrial Revolution, that made the shift from mercantile economics to capitalism. Capitalism, the big change is where you actually invested in something productive to then create more wealth, as opposed just to accumulating things. So it's more about production and trade, capitalism is. So over time, people believe that that created a post-colonial dependency. Even after they became independent, they were still dependent on exporting raw materials, and everything was kind of taken from them, and they weren't able to really create their own economies, build their own things of that nature. Now, in terms of agriculture and the land holdings, and on the bottom, we have a map here that shows that the hearth, the primary seed hearth for maize, for example, corn, comes from this region. And then it diffused up into North America with the indigenous populations there, into South America, and eventually around the world. Now, after the Spanish came, we had what were called the minifundios. These are small land holdings. So the majority of the small farmers in the population, they were able to farm on these small farms, minifundios. The latifundios, these are land grants that were given to the Spanish conquistadors and people of Spanish descent, for the most part, the wealthy. So they'd had these large land estates and they'd run cattle on them. They weren't quite as productive as the minifundio, but it created this inequality in land ownership. We also had the traditional plantations, especially on the Caribbean coast, but also later on the Pacific coast, where you grow crops for export, bananas, pineapples, things of that nature, coffee. But we've had more modern developments that we'll see coming up. But before we do that, I want to show a traditional way of doing agriculture in Central America. And they call it the milpa, which kind of just basically means the farm system. And this has been done for thousands of years. And it starts out with corn or maize. Again, this was domesticated in this region. There's many, many varieties of corn depending on what hillside you're on. If you're in the bottoms, do you have more drought? Is it wetter? So you can grow different types of corn in different microenvironments, and that allows it to survive. If maybe you have a drought, some of the corn on another plot of land will go well. And corn is a good starch, a good source of carbohydrates. The second thing that they interplant with the corn are beans, legumes. And beans grow up the stalks of the corn, and they were domesticated here as well. So they grow up the stalks of the corn as a trellis. And then legumes, and by the way, corn also uses a lot of nitrogen from the soil. So if you just grow corn for a long time, you're gonna have to add fertilizer because it gets nitrogen poor. But beans, as a legume, they take nitrogen out of the air and they put it back into the soil. So it creates this nice cycle for nutrients, especially for nitrogen. And then the second thing, beans are a good source of protein. So you have a starch and a protein. You have a plant that takes nitrogen out of the soil and one that puts it back in. And then the third of the trilogy of this is squash. So you think about even like pumpkins, but squash are similar. They're gourds that grow on the ground. They have really big leaves, and they provide other types of nutrients. They're also a good thing for carrying water or eating out of, all of those things. But the important thing is that they cover the soil. The big leaves cover the soil, which protects it from rainfall and erosion. And a lot of these farms are on hillsides. So that's the Central American milpa. Corn uses nitrogen, but provides a lot of carbos. Beans replace the nitrogen and provide protein. And then squash, which for the most part does a lot of things, but prevents erosion. This bottom right is from my dissertation work in Honduras, where these are small milpa farmers on the minifundios. Now, traditionally, though, agriculture was mostly for export. The small farmers did grow for themselves, self-sufficient farmers. But traditionally, most of the good land was meant for export. Things like coffee, bananas, sugarcane, as well as cattle. But more modern additions include winter fruit and vegetables for export to the United States. We provide a lot of that from California, but not enough for the entire country. And so they can produce it there as well and send it up. And then something that we may talk about in our next class is things like drugs. And we've heard about the drug cartels, but a lot of it's really about the drug running that goes through Central America. Now, in terms of industry, most of these countries are very small, and they have a very small, this is the percentage of Latin American output by value added. And you can see it's quite small for most of these countries. They are quite small. Mexico is the big example. For Middle America, Mexico dominates. So think about Mexico. They've always produced things, but starting the 1960s, they came up with a thing called maquiladoras, which are basically export processing zones. These are places where, for example, a company in the US can bring down the raw materials, and then at that factory, they can have it assembled, and then it come back into the US without having to pay fees and taxes. So it's really about getting access to cheaper labor. Now, in 1994, NAFTA came into effect, and that's the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA. And that allows free movement of goods between the US and Mexico and Canada. And at this point, they created maquiladoras along the border with the United States. So our companies wouldn't have to travel as far. They could lower their transport costs, bring the raw materials right across the border, and in a factory have it assembled and then bring it right back into the United States. So you can imagine in places like, San Diego, the cost of labor is much higher than it is in Tijuana. So just a matter of a couple miles, you can just get rid of that. You can take advantage of that cheaper labor value, have it produced, and come back into the US for cheaper goods and profits for the corporations. There's a world of something in this, but we can't get into it right now. But in our next, in the Caribbean, we'll talk about this in more detail. So that led to a lot of migration from the southern part of Mexico, which is relatively poor, up into the borderlands to work in the maquiladoras. On the left-hand side, you can see a graph showing the year, number of plants, and the number of employees. And you can see how it really rose, especially the 1990s. And it really peaked around the year 2000. But then you can see by 2003, it has shrunk. And it continues to shrink a bit. And that's because transportation costs have gotten a lot less. And there was a lot cheaper labor in places like China. And so a lot of these closed up shop and went to places like China. And we saw a rise in a lot of our goods being produced in China around that time period. This shows the regional differences in GDP. So GDP is the gross domestic product per capita. We've talked about GNI, but this is GDP. It's just a little different. And it's the percent of national average for each state. In the dark green, like Nuevo León and Campeche, you can see it's 150% and above the national average. Nuevo León has a lot of a manufacturing base, a lot more higher end manufacturing. Campeche has a lot of oil wealth coming from the Gulf. And then Mexico City is higher as well. And that's because it's the center of Mexico politically and economically and one of the largest cities in the world. And then along the border with the maquiladoras, right, and that connection with the United States, you can see it's still above the national average. But when you get to the southern part of Mexico, it's below and quite a bit below. And so this is the poorest region, the southern parts of Mexico, whether it's Chiapas or Oaxaca. But as you move further north, you see you get increases in gross domestic product. So there's a regional difference within the country. And then finally, the United Nations Human Development Index. If you guys remember from a previous lecture, this is put on by the UN and it covers life expectancy at birth, GNI per capita, so productive measure, a health measure, and then education, mean years of schooling and expected years of schooling. And then you can divide the world up based on their scores into different types of categories. So you can see the US is very high developed, as well as Canada. And then you have high developing, which are countries that are approaching that. Mexico, for example, has been in the upswing. We can come down here to Costa Rica with their tourism and high-tech industries. And then Panama, because of the Panama Canal and a lot of the trade and things that go through there. With the poorer countries, they're medium developing. So they're not like Sub-Saharan Africa or even Haiti, they're medium developing. And that's Guatemala, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Honduras. And that's right in the middle. And we can see that those are the countries that don't score quite as high on the Human Development Index. Okay, so those are 3 lectures that cover Middle America, and hopefully you guys learned quite a bit about it. We'll be moving into our next section shortly, and that's on the Caribbean. And just to let you know, the Caribbean is one of my second homes, so I'm excited about that. All right, take care.